Hello, thank you for joining us on Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks. Our guest on this edition is Peter Mansbridge, who 2 years after his retirement is still perhaps one of the most recognized faces in all of Canada. Peter spent 49 years with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the last 29 of those years as chief correspondent and primary anchor of the CBC National News. He is as respected and well known by Canadians as Walter Cronkite and Tom Brokaw were by Americans during their careers. We sat down in Toronto recently with Peter Mansbridge for a good discussion on his life, career, and being Canadian. Peter, before we go back in time, let's start with your perspective today on the career that you've had. 29 years as the face of the CBC National News. Given the changes that we've seen in television news and journalism in general over the last 10 years or so, do you think it's possible for anyone to have the same kind of career opportunity that you had?
Listen, I was very lucky. You know, I was lucky the way I started. I was lucky with the people I worked with. And I was lucky with the times. I mean, times have changed. Times have changed specifically in the way consumers get their news, how they want to get it. You know, these things have changed our world.
Have they ever?
And it's had a huge impact on television ratings. So in a way, I was kind of lucky in the time period that I was in, because the challenges right now are considerable. Doesn't mean they can't be met, but they're considerable.
Being one of the most recognized faces in Canada for 3 decades, basically, some might think of it as a huge honor. Others might think of it as God, what a horrible burden, or even a curse. How did you think of it?
Never as a burden. I mean, it was always a treat. I mean, occasionally you'd have people angry at you, and that would, you know, take forms through emails, or in the old days through mail, or sometimes even on the street. But that was rare. I mean, it was an honor for me to be in the role that I was in, travel the country and the world as a representative of Canadian television and Canada. So I never considered it a burden.
What about today? 2 years into retirement, You must get tired of having to say hello and be nice to people when you're just trying to go out and have a pizza some night.
Yeah. You know, my wife is an actor. She's kind of known for what she's done on television as well. Sure. So we do have still, you know, people kind of come up to us and want to say hello. But that too is not a burden. Canadians are pretty friendly. They know when to talk to you and when to leave you alone. And for the most part, they leave you alone.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of your career, because it's a story that I think a lot of Canadian viewers probably already know, but certainly a lot of our American viewers wouldn't know the story of how you got your start. And it's very much like the old yarn about Lana Turner at Schwab's drugstore sipping a soda and gets, you know, discovered by a producer. Tell us where you were and what happened.
Well, first of all, I never finished high school, so I never went to university. It was the 1960s, sort of the mid-60s, and I was kind of having fun. I was traveling around the country in the carefree way that we used to do things in the 1960s. But at a certain point, money runs out, and you can't call on your parents anymore. You got to actually get a job.
Terrible when that happens.
Yeah, terrible. So I ended up working for a small airline in northern Manitoba, an airline called Transair at Churchill, Manitoba. So it's right on Hudson Bay. And you know, for Americans who are watching, you look at a map, you see Hudson Bay up there. It's you know, it's well on its way into the Arctic. So Churchill was right there, and it was kind of the gateway to the Arctic for supplying by air. So I was working in there, for the most part, running the freight operation. 19 years old. One day the ticket agents were kind of overwhelmed at the counter, and they asked me to announce the flight over the PA system. So I did. You know, Transair Flight 106, Thompson to Pawn, Winnipeg, now ready for boarding at Gate 1. We only had one gate at Churchill, a small airport. But anyway, everybody went rushing off to the gate except one guy who came over and he said, "Hey, I'm the manager of the local CBC Northern Service radio station, and I'm looking for someone to do the late night news. I can't find anybody who's interested." Not the late night news, late night music show.
Sure.
And he said, "Would you be interested?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely, I'd love it." I'd never thought about broadcasting, never crossed my mind. Next day I started, so that tells you a little bit about what the 1960s was like in the hiring process in broadcasting.
For sure.
And I got in, and I was there for almost 50 years in the CBC, starting in that spot.
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
Your
you try
parents,
to explain that in a journalism class
it just
at
couldn't
university,
possibly
and the
happen
kids
today.
want to riot, right?
Exactly. It couldn't happen today.
Yeah.
Your parents lived well into the 21st century, and they would have seen your career at its absolute height. They must have been very proud of their son. Was there anything that they taught you that perhaps affected your character or even your style as a broadcaster?
My character, I think, in the sense that we were a family that always discussed around the dinner table, because we always had dinner together. My sister and I, and my younger brother, and my parents. We always discussed the news of the day, which could be local, could be national, could be international. We'd grown up in England and Malaya, in Southeast Asia, and before we moved to Canada. And we always discussed issues. And so, in a way, that's what journalism's about, right? You're talking about the issues that are confronting you on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And so they instilled in me that interest, that curiosity about what was going on around me, and the ability to ask questions and tell people what you learned. That's journalism, and you elevate it through training and expertise that you pick up along the way. So I think they instilled that in me. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
But being an anchor requires more than just, obviously, curiosity or even the ability to assemble facts to make a story. Being an actor or being an anchor, you have to be a bit of an actor. Did you find that transition from being a reporter into being an anchor difficult in the early years? And did you practice it at home in front of a mirror?
No, never practiced it in front of a mirror. I was a good reporter, but not a great reporter. And there are actually few great reporters, people who have that amazing ability to boil down a story into
and
a
some
few
great
moments.
ones that you worked with at CBC.
Absolutely. Great writers.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was good. But I found my way in anchoring by doing live shows, where I was thrust on the air a couple of times because no one else was around to handle breaking news. And they saw in me, this guy's got some potential for more than just reporting. And that's where the anchoring part started. I started doing like weekend news, and then took over the newscasts in the late 80s.
Were there anchors either in Canada or on American television, or in Britain for that matter,
Right.
that you emulated yourself after, whose style that you particularly liked?
There are a couple who I really liked. I try not to, and I tell this to students, don't copy anybody. Learn from what they do, but you don't want copying. You want your own individuality. But the ones aside from in Canada that my predecessor Knowlton Nash was obviously I was very close to. But the two that I really looked up to were David Dimbleby at the BBC in Britain, who I felt was the best anchor in the world. He knew when to talk, when not to talk, which is one of the secrets of live broadcasting. And Tom Brokaw, who I had an enormous admiration for, and still do. So those were the two.
Most Canadians, again, will remember how you became the CBC anchor. It was your predecessor, Knowlton Nash, who made the bold gesture of stepping down so that you would become the Canadian CBC anchor. But there was more to it than that. And our American viewers may not know this, but at that point, you were very close to leaving Canada entirely. Tell us that story.
Well, as you know, a lot of Canadians are picked up by American networks because they're good journalists and good storytellers. And so when you look at all of the major American networks, there's all kinds of Canadians there that many Americans don't realize they're Canadians. But in the early 90s, both NBC and CBS came after me as a reporter and wanted me as a correspondent in a number of foreign locations. I ended up saying no to that because I was having a good career at the CBC in terms of being a correspondent. I moved into anchoring, and I was doing the weekend anchoring when CBS came after me in 1987. Howard Stringer, who was the kind of legendary boss at CBS and then elsewhere since, came after me and offered me the morning news program, the network morning show. It's been through so many different name changes. I can't remember what it was called at that point. I think it was the CBS Morning News. And I was gone. I mean, this was huge when you compared it.
And bigger money, I assume, as well.
A lot more money.
Yeah.
But then Knowlton said, Peter, you know, we took that gamble on you in 1968. And I'm ready to step down because I want to write some books. And this could be yours. And when he put it that way, he was right. I mean, they had taken a huge gamble on me. I was this kid loading bags, right?
Yeah, unbelievable story.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so I turned down CBS. I'd actually accepted, and I had to phone Howard and say, look, you know, and he was great. He understood, you know, he was mad, but he understood what was at stake for me. And so I ended up doing the National and doing it for a long time and never having regretted.
Yeah.
You know, CBS is a great network with a great news division, but they've never really been successful in the mornings, and they've tried everything from Walter Cronkite to you know the list. It's pretty impressive.
So you stayed here and succeeded for 29 years as the face of the national news. Through those years, you competed with the other Canadian network, CTV News, and its anchor, who was on for all those years as well, Lloyd Robertson.
Exactly.
How fierce was that competition?
We were good friends. Lloyd used to work for the CBC, and in fact, when I started reporting, Lloyd was the anchor of the National.
Yeah.
And he gave me lots of good advice in those days and continued to after. The first phone call I got when they announced that I was going to take over the National was from Lloyd, congratulating me and saying, listen, you know, we're going to stay friends through all this. And we always made time for each other. We're both, strangely enough, he was born and raised and had his first job in Stratford, Ontario, an hour and a half outside of Toronto. And that's where I live now.
Of course.
So when Lloyd comes to town, we go out for, you know, a coffee or a lunch, and it's always, people get a kick out of it.
In those years of competition, though, did you two ever quietly get together and say, you know what, I won't wear a red tie if you don't wear a blue one, or talk about your colleagues, or did you kind of keep church and state apart?
We never had conversations about ties.
No.
But I won't go beyond that.
All right, fair enough. You know, there was one ongoing controversy, particularly in your early years as anchor, and that was about your hairline, Peter. Your hairline, sort of, as each 6 months went by, your hairline.
You noticed that, did you?
Well, I didn't personally, but I know there were some TV critics in the newspapers and certainly some viewers that did, and I'm being facetious.
Right.
But was it ever a topic of discussion at the CBC editorial board?
It never came up. If it came up, it was never in my presence. I went through, as most men do as they go through hair loss, trying to decide, should I do this, shouldn't I do this? But, you know, you get over it. When you realize with some of the people you cover, you know, the real stars of the news business, not the journalists, but the people who are making news.
You bet.
And you see some of them who it's the last thing on their mind. I mean, I used to watch Pierre Trudeau. Was that ever an issue for him? No.
No. You know, over the course of your career, and including the number of years, several seasons you did hosting an interview program called Mansbridge One-on-One, you've conducted over 15,000 interviews. Tell me who some of those people really
1,000?
stand out. Yeah, the top 1,000 of the 50. But who are some of the ones that really stand out for you?
Well, listen, the obvious ones are well-known figures. You know, the Desmond Tutus, the Barack Obamas, you know, the Trudeaus, both of them. and great athletes and artists, all of whose names ring a bell to people. But quite frankly, the people I've found over time that were the most interesting were those whose names would mean nothing to you or to your audience. But people who, for some reason or other, found themselves in an extraordinary situation. And the telling of their story was fascinating. So with all those others, you know, the well-known figures, they're almost predictable. It's rare that you get them talking about things they haven't talked about before. And you know what it's like. It suddenly starts to be like a tape recorder. Out pops the answer that they've given hundreds of times already. Yeah. With, you know, for the lack of a better term, real people with real experience, whether it was from some natural disaster or a conflict or a whatever situation, their answers don't have spin. It's the real deal. And you can feel the emotion in the way they talk about the experience they had. And I've always found those most interesting from the time back in the late 70s when I was covering the exodus of the boat people from Vietnam, listening to what they went through to give an opportunity to their families, their kids, for a better place to live. To covering the tsunami in the early 2000s that left hundreds of thousands dead in Southeast Asia. Those stories are ones I'll never forget. I won't remember the names of the people I talked to, but I remember what they talked about.
For sure. Was there ever an interview subject that you just didn't like or you didn't respect, and you really had to bite your tongue from saying something that you would have liked to have said?
You mean Margaret Thatcher? She was tough. I interviewed her 3 times. The first 2 times when she was Prime Minister of Great Britain, and it was all fun. Then after she'd kind of booted out of that position, she wrote a book, The Downing Street Years, and she was on a book tour, right? So she ended up in Canada, and I got the interview, and it was brutal. Wow. It was just like, she kept accusing me of not having read the book, which is an easy claim to make if you're an author, because most people haven't read the book. Either their researchers read the book, or they've read the book cover, or they've read a review, and they go from there, which is not a criticism, it's just time. I, in fact, had read her book because I was fascinated, especially in the Falklands War, and trying to understand the leadership role that a prime minister has, especially in Britain, given its history of a wartime prime minister. And so my questions were generated around that, but she kept accusing me, pointing at me, "You've never read the book, you haven't read the book." And I go, "And I've read the book." Anyway, it was a disastrous interview. And so I was frustrated by it, and have kicked myself in the years since that I didn't say, "In fact, I read the book. Yeah. Did you write it?" Because she hadn't.
Very good question.
and I didn't, and I should have, and I'll forever regret it.
That was all part of your unflappability. I mean, your trademark on the air was your calm, as I said in the intro, your stolid reliability and impartiality. One of the things that you also did for viewers was to give viewers a sense that you really understood the issues and the stories that were on the news, whether it was the war in Afghanistan or Syria or starving children in Sudan. And part of the reason for that is you actually took the news to those places. You didn't just have reporters filing, you actually took the national news out there. Was it your idea to say to your managers that we should go to these places? And why was it important for the CBC to go to those locales?
Well, for the very reason you just explained, that it gives you credibility on those stories, whether you're on the location or later back in the studio, that you have some understanding of these. And it's the hardest part about anchoring, because most of the time you don't know, and you forget what that reporter went through to get that 2 minutes. To go to Afghanistan or to Iraq or to anywhere in the Middle East or different parts of the world. Going through the Northwest Passage.
Yeah.
Doing the National live from the Northwest Passage was a big deal. Those underlined to people that you could, not only did you want to do this and that it was important to do this, but we had the capability of doing it. My predecessors didn't. What you can do now on television. I mean, I can do the newscast with this.
Yes, you can.
It's crazy. And from anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
So as long as you can get a signal, you can get on the air.
I won't ask you your opinion of the current political situation in the United States, but I know you're just too diplomatic to give me an answer. But let me ask you this. 2 years into retirement, the world seems to have gone to hell in a handbasket in the last couple of years. Do you itch to get back? Do you wish you could be back in the saddle reporting on some of these issues, giving Canadians that sense of perspective that you were so good at? Or, whether it's the American political situation or Brexit or other geopolitical issues, climate change, or are you happy in your retirement?
I'm happy in my retirement, there's no question about that. But it is a world in disarray. There's no doubt about that either. And so you want a piece of that action. And so I've chosen to find that piece by doing documentaries. So I only do 2 a year, but they're 1 hour, and that's a different world for me than the kind of 2-minute world I lived in before. And so to do a 1 hour documentary, do it well, that's 3 or 4 months of hard work, especially when you're taking a global picture. So the last 2 that I did have been global in nature. One was a look at the progress or lack of it on human rights since the end of the Second World War. And the last one, which aired just before the summer, was on the future of war.
Wow.
Which is a huge topic.
For sure.
But it involves a lot of the things you mentioned about the disarray that's going on and where this could lead, and the likelihood that it could lead there, given the analysis by a lot of these people that I talk to around the world, who are considered their leaders in their, analysis of defense and the geopolitical situation. So that kind of journalism is different for me, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it and feel that I'm offering something, different and concrete to a world that is kind of desperate for information and context. I mean, we live in this 24/7 world where what's news in this hour is not news 24 hours from now. Yeah. People have forgotten it, moved on, and that is dangerous.
For your style, your talent, your unflappability, you've actually acquired a lot of honors in your career. You've got 13 university honorary degrees.
That's still not the same as one real degree.
Well,
I keep offering to trade.
But
how about all those honoraries for one real one?
You've got all those university degrees now. Right. You've got an Order of Canada, which I know is your proudest possession. Mm-hmm. You wear it, as all Order of Canada members do, proudly on your lapel. For a guy who didn't get past grade 12, you must sit back and think, wow, I feel pretty proud and I'm sure very humbled.
Very humbled. I mean, I've been lucky. I've done what I wanted to do. I've been in a profession that allowed me to, be myself. Simply ask questions, tell people what was going on. And I got to, stand on the shoulders of people who pushed me along the way. And this business as well as I do. You can't do it on your own. And the viewers rarely see everybody who's behind us, and that's what makes or breaks a lot of people.
I have one last question for you. Mm-hmm. You have 3 grown-up kids now. Mm-hmm. What's the most important lesson you've taught them from all the experiences you've had?
Well, it sounds trite, but it is believe in yourself. You know, life can throw some curveballs at you. I remember a chief I met in northern Manitoba in the late 60s, early 70s, who said to me, life is like it's like a creek or a river. You know, it doesn't go straight. Bounces off rocks here and there, logs, whatever. But it eventually gets to its goal. So believe in yourself. Set a goal, go for it.
Peter, we're out of time, but this has been delightful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jim.
And if I can borrow your sign-off phrase, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join us again on another edition of Canada Files. See you next time.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the John and Jocelyn Barford Family Foundation, as well as the following donors: Mary Alice Davis, in memory of Glenn W. Davis; John and Margaret Deeks; Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks; Richard and Donna Ivy; Alice and Ted Kernahan, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation; Andrew and Valerie Pringle; Eleanor and Francis Shen; the Sonner Foundation; the Browning Watt Foundation; William E. Wilder; and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.